The special report that we've conducted with Athol Yates examines the role of regional military forces in disaster risk management in the Asia Pacific. We specifically looked at the role of three militaries: the Australian Defence Force, the US Armed Forces and the Japanese Self-Defence Forces. And in short, what we found was this is going to be a growth sector for the military in the Asia Pacific. There are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, even if you leave aside the impact of climate change, the Asia Pacific is now already the most disaster-prone region in the world. And we believe that will increase not only through population pressure, but also because of urbanisation, and also because the degree of resilience that's been built in by communities and the infrastructure in the Asia Pacific is quite poor, making these areas quite vulnerable. Many of the increased populations in Asia are moving to areas that are particularly prone to natural hazards, whether it be floods or earthquakes or landslides. So why the militaries will be involved more? Firstly, because of their capabilities, their logistic capabilities, their manpower, their ability to self-sustain when they deploy, all mean that the armed forces will be the first port of call, as it were, when disaster strikes. Even though, in theory, armed forces are supposed to be a last resort, we found in our study that increasingly it's militaries that are the first on the scene, and then they make way over time for international humanitarian groups. But broadly, we found that military forces are going to be increasingly involved across the spectrum of disaster management, not just in the response phase, but also increasingly, interestingly, in preparations, in the mitigation phase, and also in recovery. This year, we've seen not only disasters in a range of developing countries in our region, but of course we've seen the dreadful disasters in developed countries. That's Japan in March this year in the Great East Asian earthquake, and also in Christchurch, New Zealand with the earthquake. We're used to, I guess, to seeing disasters in developing countries, but now we now know that developed countries aren't immune from these sort of natural hazards. I guess the other recent initiative that makes the report timely was the East Asia Summit in Bali, because there Australia and Indonesia were very successful in proposing a regional disaster response plan amongst the 18 East Asian country states. That plan calls for a relaxation of national borders when it comes to getting in disaster responses, to allowing, for example, recognition of each other's quarantine services for the deployment of health professionals, to making sure that regional military forces also have easy access, and of course coordination of responses, simplifying that coordination when responses come in. So that plan went forward at Bali, and I think again it underlines the point that most countries in the Asia Pacific are recognising that our region is disaster prone and therefore requires greater cooperation and coordination, and that inevitably will involve the deployment of military force. Look, obviously in any military deployment in disasters, the humanitarian dimension looms large, in fact probably the largest. But what our study found was that increasingly there are a range of other drivers for governments to deploy military forces to disaster. And in a way, I suppose these are best encapsulated by the phrase disaster diplomacy. What we found was that countries deploy their militaries to affected disaster states to demonstrate their friendship, solidarity with the affected country, to shore up bilateral ties, to send a message to other countries that the assisting state is interested in the welfare of the country that's been impacted. So broadly speaking, there are diplomatic and confidence building measures. Indeed, what we found was that military deployments enable military cooperation with the host country's armed forces. That builds confidence and trust between countries. It allows countries to understand each other's operating environment, their training procedures and so on. So there are broad confidence and trust building aspects to disaster diplomacy, if you like. And what we found was that countries are increasingly attracted to disasters as a way of building confidence. They're, if you like, the low-hanging fruit of trust and confidence building between countries. Much easier to undertake than, for example, some of the harder areas of security cooperation, such as military exercises and so forth. The best recent example I can give you is only last week, the Australian Defence Force and the Chinese PLA conducted for the first time a humanitarian and disaster relief exercise in China. And the conclusions of the exercise, according to the Australian leader of the contingent, were that both sides learnt a lot about each other's operating capabilities, learnt to work with one another. So in the event that we do deploy together in a future disaster, it's not as though we're exchanging business cards for the first time with the PLA. So what we found overall was that countries are attracted to using their militaries as a form of soft power. And indeed, one military officer said to us that, look, this is an example of smart power in deploying our military to assist a particular country, because it allowed the relations between these two countries to develop. It's certainly true that the capabilities of regional armed forces are being enhanced, and therefore, along with that, their ability to themselves respond to disasters. We saw, for example, in the recent Thai floods that Thailand initially did ask the Americans at PACOM for military assistance, but it soon became evident that the sort of capabilities that they were really after weren't military capabilities. They were sandbags, they were small, fast craft, etc., to navigate around cities that had been flooded. So the broad point is right that countries are enhancing their capabilities, but what we found in our study was that there are still many states whose military is not in a position to adequately respond, and indeed the fact that advanced militaries such as the US, Australia and Japan, by virtue of their sheer capabilities, are going to be increasingly demanded, particularly where you have major disasters. And we saw, of course, in the case of Japan in March this year, a triple whammy of the earthquake, the tsunami and the nuclear accident. And of course, one of the great challenges for the Asia Pacific is where you do get natural calamities overlaying with industrial accidents, and that will really require a much greater degree of military contingency planning than we've seen in the past. Well, the report makes several recommendations, indeed 5 recommendations, but let me just highlight 2. I think firstly, governments in the Asia Pacific need to explicitly recognise that when they deploy their military forces to disasters, it isn't just all about being a good Samaritan. There are other security, diplomatic, foreign policy objectives associated with these deployments, and I think it would be very useful for governments to spell out what the broader national security benefits are associated with these deployments, along of course with the humanitarian objectives. I think in that way the domestic support for the use of armed forces to undertake these missions will be sustained over time. I guess the other recommendation that I would highlight would be, given that we focused on Australia, US and Japan as case studies, we believe that incorporated in the trilateral dialogue that the 3 countries already have should be an explicit focus on humanitarian and disaster response areas for cooperation. I think the area, or the areas where the 3 countries can work together in disaster response can be enhanced over time, and as an early step towards that, we feel that the trilateral dialogue ought to hoist disaster response into its formal agenda.